I have to admit a little personal note before I begin, that when I got the invitation, I hesitated a little bit because I'm not an indigenous person myself. That's true that I'm very involved in this area and conversation and movements of dialogue and solidarity with the indigenous peoples and learning. But as an Arab Christian from the Middle East, and the conferences on Asian Christianities, I thought maybe I should propose to say something about Christians in the Middle East. But since I have a divided heart on both topics, so I thought I'll stick to the topic assigned to me and share my reflection on that. Of course, in the Middle East, we don't talk about ourselves as Asian Christians. We are Middle Eastern Christians. And we are in the Middle East of what? We're not in West Asia, we're in the Middle East of Europe. So that puts us a little bit in a different relation to Asian Christians. And that's, however, this is a different topic for a different day. In the current issue of Concilium, I have a little reflection on Christianity in the Middle East. So if you'd like to know my thinking on my decolonial thinking on the Christian community in the Middle East, it's in the issue. I've been living in North America as an immigrant for more than 25 years. I started in my doctoral work in theology. I started learning about the relationship of the church and the indigenous peoples in the Americas. It was almost by accident that I took a course in my program, in my doctoral program, on the church that took place in Mexico, and part of it was in the state of Chiapas, in the Diocese of San Cristobal de las Casas. And it was the first exposure to a local church where the majority of the people in that region are indigenous from multiple Mayan groups, and where a local church has radically taken on the cause of justice in relationship to indigenous people and the history of prejudice and racism and discrimination and poverty. So it was a fascinating encounter that became the beginning of a long learning journey. However, I'm today going to focus my reflection on this relationship, but from a Canadian perspective. That's the country where I actually live at the moment. I divide my notes, my remarks, in three parts. The first one is on the question of the violence of forced disconnection. And the second point is on what I read as part of my work in theology as the resurgence or the rising again of indigenous peoples. And the last part is on some theological reflection and questions. As some of you might already know, Canada has been going through a major change in terms of its relations with the indigenous peoples of Canada. And this didn't come out from the benevolence of neither the state nor the church. This happened because of the organizing and mobilizing of indigenous people over the last few decades. As a result of a class action lawsuit against the Canadian government and churches in the 90s, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in favor of the survivors of the residential schools from the indigenous communities all across Canada have taken the government to court because of the disconnection because of the violence that they lived in the residential schools over a century and a half, which caused a lot of pain, harm, damage, and destruction of their culture and their ways of life. So a group of survivors from these schools in the 80s and 90s started organizing and took the government and the churches to court. And the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in their favor. And part of the settlement agreement was for the government and the churches to apologize and commit in a process of restitution and restoration of this relationship and helping the survivors in their integration in Canadian society. Sorry, this is a little. So, not many have heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, but that's a very important turning point, I would say, in Canadian history. In 2008, the government issued an official apology to the Indigenous peoples, regretting what happened in the previous 150 years, and basically apologizing for the systemic and state policy of forcibly educating and civilizing Indigenous peoples. And this happened in a violent way, primarily by taking children from their communities, beginning in the middle of the 19th century, taking children from their communities into some boarding schools that were run by all the main Canadian churches. So in this process, the government has, as a result of the court action, there was a settlement agreement that on issuing an apology from the government and the churches and entering in a program of educating, researching what happened in that history and educating the Canadian public about the past. So part of the agreement was to start a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which began over in 2008 and just ended in December 2015. There is a website for those who are interested, and the documents, the findings, and the research is all documented. It's available to the public. As I am going to read one story from a survivor published in these documents that in my reading captures the history of this violence between the state, the church, and the Indigenous peoples, and raises the issue of the important questions that related to our topic of land, ecology, and peace in relation to Indigenous peoples. So my second point is on the resurgence, and the first part of the resurgence is to capture what exactly the level of violence that people lived or experienced under this policy of almost a century and a half. Indigenous Canadian Anishinaabe elder Fred Kelly, who is a residential school survivor, explains this disconnection from land and culture and language, the things we've been talking about over the past few years, and the impact of this destruction on him and his people. I quote, "To take the territorial lands away from a people whose very spirit is so intrinsically connected to Mother Earth was to actually dispossess them of their very soul and being. It was to destroy whole indigenous nations. Weakened by disease and separated from their traditional foods and medicines, First Nations peoples had no defense against further government encroachments on their lives. Yet they continued to abide by the terms of the treaties, trusting in the honor of the Crown to no avail. They were mortally wounded," and that's the key point, the mortally wounded, "in mind, body, heart, and spirit. And turned them into the walking dead. Recovery would take time, and fortunately, they took their sacred traditions underground to be practiced in secret until the day of revival that would surely come. I am happy that my ancestors saw fit to bring their sacred beliefs underground when they were banned and persecuted because of them and the Creator. My people are alive, in them I found my answers. So this is the first part of the woundedness and the disconnection from the land, tradition, culture, language, and that's in this one story from an indigenous elder captures the history of a people and what happened to them over a century and a half. And the second, the other side of this story is the story of resurgence that has been taking place in, I will also use an example from Canada, but this really captures what's been happening all over the continent, from southern Chile to northern Canada, which is a phenomenal experience. I use for this the work of an indigenous author, poet, and an artist, Leanne Simpson. She is an Anishinaabe scholar from the Ontario region, and that has herself, like Fred Kelly, but has experienced this kind of healing and resurgence through a return and recovery of the indigenous tradition. And she said, Simpson says the current indigenous resurgence is a new form of resistance. The focus is shifted from trying to transform the colonial outside into a flourishment of the indigenous inside. She affirms, the resurgence goes beyond survival, and its primary goal is to nurture an indigenous way of life that is an alternative to the dominant colonial system. If you want one book that gives you a good sense of this big story, it's this book, because it's captured in such a profound language, relying a return to rediscovering the value of the creation stories, the prophetic tradition, and the power of healing that this kind of renewal or resurgence, as she would call it, is about. I'm going to use one quote from Simpson that somehow captures what this resurgence is about, or the elements of this resurgence. She says, we need our elders, our languages, and our lands, along with vision, intent, commitment, community, and ultimately action. We must move ourselves beyond resistance and survival to flourishment and into the Bimadiziwin, which means the Mino Bimadiziwin is a very technical term that's used by indigenous people all over the Americas, and in the South it's more used as a term of the buen vivir, or the living good or living well. This has captured this healing and resurgence in a very profound way. She says, if this approach does nothing else to shift the current state of affairs, and I believe it will ground our peoples in their own cultures and teaching that provide the ultimate antidote to colonialism. So I found that in my studies or relations and participation in indigenous events all the way from Canada to Chile, is that they found the antidote. There is an antibiotic for colonialism, and if people are interested, they can ask what is the secret in these movements of survival, resistance, and hope that are emerging now as a result of this process. Simpson is convinced that the main source of the force for resurgence and resisting colonialism is coming from the land. In her words, ethically, it's my emphatic belief that the land, reflected in the Anishinaabe thought and philosophy, compels us towards resurgence in virtually every respect. For Anishinaabe thinkers, she adds, resistance and resurgence are not only our response to colonialism, they are our only responsibility in face of colonialism. Resurgence is our original instruction. This resurgence is a long-term spiritual and slow process that requires ongoing mobilization, which involves sacrifice, persistence, and is a slow, painful movement. 15 minutes go by very fast. I barely scratched the surface of a big and complex story, but I want to very quickly conclude. This story, it doesn't although it's coming from a Canadian experience that is changing Canada in profound ways. Canada is not the same that the country we had 10 years ago, and the literature coming from Indigenous thinkers, writers, poets in the arts, and in the public forum and the universities is phenomenal as a result of these movements of resistance. So I will quickly move to some theological questions, and I will not go over time. In last November, at our school, we had a great interest in this conversation between indigenous peoples and the church. And we invited a group of indigenous theologians from Chile, Bolivia, and Mexico, and United States and Canada to speak about their experience and relation with Christianity from this perspective of their revival or resurgence. And we had some Christian theologians who are in conversation with indigenous peoples to respond, but we privileged the indigenous voice from each section, from each area. And the conclusion is that, very simply, is that despite all the programs of trying to assimilate indigenous peoples, whether in the nation-states projects in Chile and from Chile to Canada, and in the churches and in Christianity to evangelize and civilize, this hasn't happened. And the problem with the states like Canada today is that this project failed. And with it, there is a major realization among the Canadian churches of a big moral failure, that this whole civilization, evangelization project that they invested so much in, for one thing, is collapsed, and it has not. The indigenous people are still there, they are still speaking, and in fact, they are speaking with a new force and new energy. And the other side of this is not only that they are still there, but that the moral failure and the disintegration of the Christian project is leading many to look to indigenous experiences, especially in relationship to spirituality and the land and healing and community, as a source for the renewal or the future of our own countries. So the big theological question today for us is, one, how come our Christian theologies for a century and a half were involved in this project of violence and did not even notice it? I mean, you can be involved in a civilizational evangelization violent project for a decade or two and then realize something. But to go for a century and a half and not realize the impact of this violence on the destruction of people, culture, and causing actually physical death. I mean, the story, the voice of Fred Kelly captures really well the generalized experience of these communities. So that's a big theological question. The second question is, now the churches are apologizing, but without necessarily changing. So you apologize and continue to do the same thing in a milder mode. And this is what I call a soft colonialism or soft coloniality. So the theology of religion and the way we structure this relationship towards the original people of the land has not fundamentally changed, and there is no clear way out in the theology of religion. How do you construct an equal relationship and for this learning to happen? And thirdly, I did my final phase of theological studies in Ontario at the Toronto School of Theology, and we studied contextual theology was a big thing in the late 90s. But we study and converse with contextual theologians from around the world, but the indigenous communities that all around Toronto and the state of Ontario, and these are not secrets, the elders and the right people have written and published their thinking about their spirituality, their worldviews, their prophetic tradition, etc. And this was never part of engaging contextual thinking in Canada, and still hasn't happened. So another big question is what blinded us theologically from seeing the important spiritual tradition and conversing with this as a partner for producing a Christianity in the land that is really in dialogue, and that's now it's in a way a bit too late based on the state of the affairs, and it's coming from it's almost we are at the stage of a reversed mission. In my work in Chiapas and encounter with the work of Bishop Samuel Ruiz, who was instrumental over 40 years in transforming the local church, Ruiz, after he retired in 2000, and 3 years later, he wrote a book, Me convertieron los indígenas. The indigenous people converted me. So bishops are going as missionaries and getting converted in their encounter. And this is only one of multiple stories across the Americas where missionaries and bishops who entered this world and left behind their, this required special people with a special charisma. Not every experience has produced these results. But so there is this process of new possibility for a dialogue at the moment of this moral failure of Christianity. And that is opening a new possibility for a transformation for a moment. It's fundamentally challenging the construction of the states, the nation states, as well as the churches that were implicated in this product of modernity that's falling apart and not being able to provide possibilities of living together according to the way we live, the living well for the future. So I will stop here because my time is up, and I'll be open to questions or comments later. Thank you.